Hello friends, I welcome each and every one of you to this online lecture series. This particular series is on Western political thought, and today we are going to continue discussing about Machiavelli, which we have already begun in our previous video. So today this will be the second part of our lecture on Machiavelli. As you can see here, our topic will be Machiavelli on religion, Renaissance, and human nature. Before going into his ideas on religion, let's look back what we have discussed in our previous lecture. This is the present political map of Europe, which shows part of Italy and its neighboring states. Here we have Italy, and here we have Germany, France, and Spain. These were the three most powerful states neighboring Italy during the time of Machiavelli. Economically, Italy was quite prosperous or wealthy, but politically, Italy was divided, weak, and often fought as a prey to the imperial ambitions of the French, German, and Spanish. During those days, Italy was divided into so many small states, out of which the five major states were Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples. In a nutshell, to recap what we discussed earlier, Machiavelli was an Italian political and military theorist, civil servant, historian, playwright, and poet. The Machiavellis or his family were from an ancient middle-class family whose income came mainly from the rent of the landed property. In short, they were quite prosperous, or they were well-to-do family. His father was a doctor of law or civil lawyer, and Machiavelli seems to have been carefully educated in humanistic studies, although he never learned Greek. He specifically got the best education available during those days except Greek, which were one of the most important language of studies during those days. He entered Florentine government in 1498 and served for 14 years till 1512. During his tenure as a government servant in the Florentine government, he was engaged in numerous and sometimes lengthy diplomatic missions which took him to France, Switzerland, Germany, and Rome. After living for about 58 years, Machiavelli passed away in 1527 in his home. This is what we can see about Machiavelli's life in a nutshell. Now, let's come to his ideas on religion and later on Renaissance. Here, the fall of Rome in 410 AD, meaning to say, till about the 5th century AD, Rome was a very powerful empire in Europe. But the fall of Rome was followed by a bloody series of barbarian invasions for about 60 years. This put an end to the Western Empire, the western part of Europe, but the eastern part of Europe continued to exist as a united state till 1453. That empire later on came to be known as the Byzantine Empire. With the defeat of the Roman Empire in the early part of the 5th century AD, a new ages known as Dark Ages began in Europe. This period or these ages is called Dark Ages because men were groping for ideas in a barren intellectual land. Earlier, Europe flourished under the Roman Empire, but with the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe have seen Dark Ages where the intellectual group of those men, in thirst for new ideas or new knowledge. It was during this period that Christianity took its root in Europe. Of course, prior to this, Christianity could not flourish as much as it might have faced. But taking the advantage of this dark age, Christianity brings light to the dark world of Europe, and as a result, it flourished for the people who were starved of ideas, who lacked ideas, or who were in need of new ideas. And during this period also, Christian converts keep increasing, and even many of the rulers were converted to Christianity, meaning to say, Christianity prospered in the whole of Europe. Let's remember one thing. These barbarian invasions or invaders who invaded different parts of Europe were strong militarily, but they were not united under one king or one ruler. In different parts or in different events, they defeated many of the kings of Europe. But since they could not come together as one, and since the Dark Ages also make Europe in thirst for or starve for new ideas, Christianity was able to take advantage of it by converting more people, including many of the rulers, and at the same time by inculcating new ideas, which is the ideas of Christian faith. In the initial stage of this period, Christianity goes well along with the political authority, meaning the church and the king or the rulers goes together very well, and the Pope even recognized the emperors or the rulers as its temporal lord, particularly the Byzantine emperor. Along with this, feudalization, or the process of feudalization had continued, and by the beginning of 11th century, feudalization in Europe had become more or less complete, because it was during those periods that small landowners had given their estates to the more powerful landowners, receiving fief or receiving rent in return. Why they have to consign their estates to the more powerful landowners was that with the barbarian invaders increasing in Europe, the small landowners thought that they might not be able to protect their land unless they are protected by a more powerful landowners. And with the big or more powerful landowners taking over most of the lands in return for fief or in return for rent to the original owners, feudalization or the process of feudal system have completed by the beginning of 11th century. And at the top of this society or this feudal society, there was the king. The hierarchy of the society was headed by the king, and this king indirectly ruled the people, the common people, through his powerful feudal lords. Meaning to say, the king was not able to have influence on the common people directly. It is only through the feudal lords that the king was able to influence the people. In short, the king controlled the feudal lords, and the feudal lords in return control the common people for the king. And on the other hand, the church, who was supposed to take interest on the other worldliness or about spiritual well-being or about eternal life, slowly or started increasingly become interested in its own material prosperity. Earlier, the main purpose of the church was to save the soul, to have an eternal happiness or perfect happiness. But slowly, the church also take interest in material prosperity. And this increasing role of the church in its own material prosperity slowly came in conflict with the king or the temporal ruler. That's why the ecclesiastical lords who took care of the soul now converted themselves into feudal lords. They themselves become feudal lords and became an essential partner for the ruling class initially. In the initial stage, when the clergy or when the church leaders take interest in material well-being, they became a good partner for the ruling class. But the conflict started between the church and the civil rulers with the investiture controversy in the 11th century itself. Investiture controversy simply means the power of the king or the emperor to change or to reinstate the pope or the bishops or the church leaders. So when the king, particularly the king of France, who was one of the most powerful kings during those days, tried to interfere in the internal matters of the church, which later on came to be known as investiture controversy, there was strong conflict between the pope and the king. So in 1075 AD, Henry IV deposed Pope Gregory VII, and the pope in return excommunicated the emperor and many of his loyal bishops. So there was action and counteraction, or reaction and counter-reaction, from both the King of France and the Pope. It was during this time, during this period in history between 11th century and 14th century, that political writings sparked up or mushroom in support of either the papal cause or the secularist cause. Meaning to say, it was during this period of crisis that many political writings came out, some favoring the cause of the church and the other favoring the cause of the king or the temporal rulers. One of the main figures who came out in support of the church was Saint Thomas Aquinas. He was one of the most important thinkers of the medieval period. Now, in his book, which is known as Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas argues that human wisdom or human knowledge consists of the pursuit of truth. This truth, according to him, is attainable through Christian faith or through faith in God. However, he also believed that a substantial part of, or a large part of, this truth can also be understood through natural reason or human reason. And hence, he is trying to say that there is no contradiction between faith and human reason. Aquinas also contains that temporal authority may provide a good life to man. It may help in providing a very good life to man to some extent. But perfect happiness, which means eternal salvation and blessedness, or life after death, perfect happiness in the life after that can be provided only by the church, which are armed with spiritual authority. Only if a church is armed with spiritual authority, only then the church can give perfect happiness or salvation to human soul. So for this, Aquinas insists that both temporal authority, that is the power of the king or the power of the state, and the church are both important. However, the power of the secular master, that is the king or the ruler, or simply the power of the state, should be subordinated to the church. Following Aquinas, there was also a person called Marsiglio of Padua, who attempted to genuinely deal with pure politics. Unlike Aquinas or many of the other medieval thinkers, Marsiglio of Padua wants to deal with only politics. He wants to liberate the state or the ruler from the paramount authority of the church. He wants to free the state from the influence of the church. In other words, he wants to separate the church from the state. His ideas, that means the idea of Marsiglio of Padua, marked the end of an alliance between religious and political thought, which dominated Europe for about 1,000 years. Meanwhile, the Crusades, particularly those Crusades related with the Holy Land, have opened many new avenues for trade and commerce. In other words, the Crusades did not just go and try to liberate certain areas from the barbarians, particularly the Muslims and others, but with that Crusades comes new avenues for trade and commerce, which the Crusaders have taken into advantage for their own benefit. And again, it was during this period that a new class of people, so-called the mercantile class or the business class, have emerged gradually. It was with this background that one has to view the political ideas of Machiavelli as the giant of his time. To continue with, whereas the church wanted the division of Italy, Machiavelli wanted a united, regenerated, and a strong, powerful Italy. So many of the ideas of Machiavelli came in contrast with that of the belief of the church of those days. Whereas the church wanted a divided Italy so that they can continue the papal states, Machiavelli on the other hand wanted a strong and very powerful Italy, powerful enough to be the master of the whole of Europe, if not the world. The medievalist notion of the earth as flat with hell beneath and heaven as its canopy was debunked by Renaissance scholars, including scientists, geographers, voyagers, astronomers, etc. Because considering the earth as flat and hell below the earth and heaven above it has no longer been accepted. The medievalists also view on the heliocentrism, meaning to say the earth as the center of the universe, which was strongly supported by the church. But it was again contested by Copernicus and later by Galileo Galilei using telescope. Now, many of the belief or the teaching of the church have been one after another proven wrong. And with this, Machiavelli developed some sort of hatred towards the church because the church could not accept science or reality as truth. Machiavelli was also not much impressed by the medieval Christians' stress on asceticism, poverty, humility, misery, and the worthlessness of earthly person, but he was more interested in this real world. In short, Machiavelli was not much interested in the teaching of the church, which tried to influence the people to remain a life of asceticism, poverty, humility, misery, so that they might get a better life in the life after death. Machiavelli, on the other hand, was not impressed with all these ideas. Rather, he was more impressed on the material world of this present world and not on the world beyond or death. As opposed to the teaching of the church, he was inspired by the teaching of the Renaissance humanism, which defended the freedom of the human spirit and knowledge. During most of the Renaissance period, during most of the medieval period, the church had influenced the whole of human existence. People have to think, people have to live according to the teaching of the church alone. However, with the coming of Renaissance, along with humanism as its core, Machiavelli is more interested in now defending the freedom of human spirit, human knowledge from the clutch or from the chain of Christian domination. In short, Machiavelli was anti-church and anti-clergy, but he was not anti-religion. And as we have already discussed in our previous class, Machiavelli even died as a Christian who was given Christian burial. Now, to continue with, on the other, Renaissance, which began in the latter part of the medieval period, probably by the latter part of the 14th century, Florence had become the center of this new movement called Renaissance. Florence during those days was not only the center of the Italian Renaissance, but also a banking and commercial capital. By virtue of being a peninsula, Italy had a very large advantage of being the commercial and banking capital, apart from being the intellectual center. This period marked the decline of feudal lords and the emergence of the bourgeoisie or the mercantile class, who needed a new image of man. Earlier, men were portrayed as obedient, good, or someone who would always listen to what the church have said. But now, with the emergence of new social class called bourgeoisie or business class, these people, this slowly emerging rich class of people, now needed a new image of man, or new type of man who would be brave and self-confident, who is also not scared to fight for his own way, who is not seeking bliss in the next world but pin hopes in his own energy, initiative, and ingenuity. Now, people started thinking about human beings who would love to fulfill his own self-interest rather than the interest of the life after death. The Renaissance was, in a sense, man's awakening about himself. In short, Renaissance or rebirth or re-awakening, what we call, is simply about man's awakening about himself. When human beings started asking themselves, who are they? What type of person he is? Or what are the capabilities or what are the potential he have? And when he slowly realized that he has so much of potential in contrast to what the church have taught them, that is what we call rebirth or renaissance in its essence. Now people slowly realize their autonomous sphere of authority, colossal or strong power or very great power, and all the great possibilities that he can do by himself without the help of God or without depending on luck. Renaissance depicted man as confident, self-aware, and courageous, who would no longer depend on the will of God and faith, but the power of his own arms. Now, slowly human beings no longer depend on the teaching of the church or the will of God or just by faith, but they started depending more on the power of his own arms and capabilities. This Renaissance also preached a secular and scientific view of life and made material success the main goal of life. It is no longer getting salvation or perfect happiness, but now material well-being or material success as the main goal of life. With new discoveries, inventions, explorations, along with the flourishing art and literature, including painting, which was at its peak, the position or the authority of the church has been put under severe threat with the emergence of all these humanism during the Renaissance period. The idea of humanism as a way of looking at the world has become increasingly prominent during this period. Now, coming on to his or Machiavelli's ideas on human nature. Now, with the background that we have just discussed about the brief history of medieval Europe before and during the time of Machiavelli, and the rise of European Renaissance, and also the idea of humanism in contrast to the teaching of the church. Now let's come to his idea on human nature, how Machiavelli view human being. According to Machiavelli, men are essentially ungrateful and selfish creature who cares only for his power and fame, his success and security. In short, human beings, according to Machiavelli, care only for their selfish interests, only for the success only for the security, only for the power and fame. The individual, according to him, is wicked, selfish, and egoistic. These three words sum up the human nature view of Machiavelli. That's why I put in bold letter here. He is fundamentally, individual according to Machiavelli is fundamentally weak, ungrateful, and exhibitionist, artificial, lacks honesty and justice, and ensures to avoid danger and excessively desirous of gain. He argues that, or he view human nature lacking honesty, very artificial, who don't like justice, who always wants to avoid danger, and who is excessively desirous of gain. However, Machiavelli also says that human beings wants to be morally right. Human beings are in favor of justice or honesty only when it is going to help them, or it is going to help achieve their personal goal, which is success in terms of material benefit. He conceives human being as being basically restless, ambitious, aggressive, and accusative, or greedy, in a state of constant strife and anarchy, disconnected and dissatisfied, for human needs were unlimited. As we all know, human beings are human wants are unlimited, but the means to satisfy them are very, very much limited. Since there are limited resources on this earth, human beings are basically restless, ambitious, aggressive, greedy, and they sometimes prefer anarchy as long as it is going to help them achieve their material goal. Being essentially antisocial, anarchical, selfish, greedy, and sensual, the individual would readily forgive the murder of his father, but never the seizure of his property. This is a very, very serious statement which was made by Machiavelli. He says that a person, since is too greedy or too selfish, sometimes he may even forgive a person who murdered his father, his own father, but he will never forget, or he will never forgive that person who seized his property, or who seized his wealth, who have taken his wealth, unless he is given back. Even if he is given back, he will still remember the person who had stolen or who had seized his property. An individual, according to Machiavelli, desires power, glory, and material well-being, and hence desires for novelty, fear, and love dictated his action. Machiavelli pointed out that human mind tend to glorify the past, decry the present, and hope for a better future. I think even till now this is partly true, because every society or every community always want to glorify their history, and they decry the present. They are not very happy with the present, and they are always hoping for a better future. Interestingly, Machiavelli presumed that human nature remained constant, for history moved cyclically or in cyclic way, alternating between growth and decay. Even within a family, sometimes we can see that in a particular generation, a family would be doing well, and after some generation, they will be in a very pathetic condition. Then slowly, they come back to a much better family. So Machiavelli presumed that human nature remained constant. Human nature remained the same, for history also moved cyclically, alternating between growth and decay. Machiavelli's man, according to him, Machiavelli's human being is a master of his own fate, who would not merely submit to fortune, but wrestle with and more try to rule over his own fate. Instead of depending on the teaching of the church or the will of God, or by his own faith, he will try to fight against his own fate, and he will try to better his own future. Fortune, according to Machiavelli, is like a woman who is to be kept under control by rough handling. At present, this may not be a very good statement, but considering the kind of patriarchal society that is prevalent during those days, it is, I think, worth compare between fortune and woman. And according to him, fortune and woman, according to Machiavelli, has to be kept by using force. He has so much contempt for the traditional Christian values, which emphasize humility, submissiveness, resignation, and asceticism. So the whole idea of Machiavelli hover around the image of man who loses his manliness by sitting too near to the throne of God, or by passively waiting for a sudden flash of luck. See, he was, when writing, he was always hovering around the kind of image that he have about human beings who keep on listening to the word of God, and thereby who always feel that they are always beside God, and lose his manliness, his strength, and keep waiting for the blessing of God without doing much work. Instead of a person who always thought that he is nearby God, or he is always working along with God, and keep waiting for something to happen suddenly, out of chance or out of luck, Machiavelli prefers a very, very beastly man, or a very, very cruel man who glorifies himself. According to Christian faith, being cruel or being a beast who glorified himself, or who always look for fame, is not a good thing. It is against Christian teaching. But according to Machiavelli, this kind of man who rejoices in his own brutality and virility, making whatever maneuvers he deemed necessary to achieve his goal, as much better than those who always think that they walk along the way of God and keep on waiting for something to happen in a flash of luck. For Machiavelli, success alone is the criteria, or the criterion for man's greatness, no matter what the means employed are. The means may be good or bad. It may be morally wrong or morally right. It doesn't matter. According to Machiavelli, the only criteria to judge a man is how successful he is. No matter the kind of means he uses, as long as he is successful in his own endeavor, it is okay. Human life to him is a continuous battle that has to be won at any cost. Only those who win are good and honorable, and they have the right to rule over others. Meaning to say, the life of human from birth to death is a continuous battle. You have to fight one battle after another, and you have to win at any cost. If you can't win that battle, you won't get respect, you won't be considered good enough, and you won't even have the right to rule over others. Only people who are bold, who are brave, who are cunning, or who have the right state of mind can be a successful person, and only those people can be ruler over others. However, despite presenting a gloomy picture of human nature, Machiavelli recognizes the importance of order provided by a stable and lawful political community, which consists of public-spirited and virtuous citizens. For such an arranged man fulfill the human need of being admired, respected, and remembered. Now, as we have just discussed, Machiavelli presented a very, very gloomy picture, a very, very bad picture of human nature. But he was also he also recognizes the importance to have a stable, a lawful, and a strong state, or a strong ruler who will be mainly from the public spirited, meaning who think for the welfare of the people, and who are virtuous citizens, or who are the enlightened ones. Because unless we have a strong, united, and prosperous state, the citizens or the common people will not be able to have a good life. So to get a good life or to have a best possible life, we need a stable and lawful political community or ruler. Machiavelli's reference to an individual's love for power, reputation, keenness to establish superiority over others, and the innate desire to control and dominate others were confined mainly to the traits of the elite. For example, other thinkers like Nietzsche or Hobbes or many other attributed their view of human nature to the whole population. But according to Machiavelli, all this gloomy picture that we have just discussed is for the group of people who are considered elite in the society. To end with, for this, in order to control the very gloomy kind of human being, or the very evil and selfish and cruel human being, Machiavelli needed a strong ruler who would preserve the state without undermining or flouting laws or inflicting harm and attain fame and respect. Machiavelli needed a strong ruler, be it a king or a republican kind of government, where they wouldn't undermine or they wouldn't flout laws or they wouldn't inflict harm, but at the same time attain fame and respect. In short, Machiavelli have presented a very, very evil human nature, a very, very gloomy picture of human being. He considered all human beings essentially or naturally selfish, egoistic, and cruel. They are by nature born with all these bad qualities. So in order to control all these human beings, Machiavelli says that he needs a very, very strong government. These are some of the suggested readings which I've already introduced to you earlier, so let me repeat again. The first one I think is a very essential reading. The second is important if you want to read Western political Western political thought from certain perspective. And this is important if since it provides any of the basic information about most of the theories. And at last, the Prince and Discourses, which are the original writing of Niccolo Machiavelli, are important if you really want to understand much deeper into his ideas. This will be the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much. And in the next lecture, we will discuss about Machiavelli's thoughts on separation of church and politics. And maybe if we have time, we will also discuss about his ideas on prince or the rulers. Thank you so much.